My hot rod Dyna Lowrider S versus my Lowrider ST. Let's talk about it. Alright, what's going on YouTube? Fxdls Brooklyn is back in the building, and this has been a popular topic that a lot of folks have requested. This was actually voted #1 through my Patreon of a video that folks wanted to see, which is comparing my 2016 Dyna Lowrider S to my current 2022 Lowrider ST. And yeah, at first I was like, it doesn't really seem to make sense to make a video on this because this bike is the furthest thing from stock right now, whereas this bike is essentially fully stock. So it's kind of hard to make a comparison in a really objective way. But then I thought about it, and the more miles that I put on the ST, the more I actually am starting to think that this comparison does make sense. Because first and foremost, here's what I'll say is, y'all know what I have into this bike. I have a lot of money into this bike. This bike has been my blood, sweat, and tears since 2016. You know, we have a lot of miles into this bike, a lot of work into this bike, and this is like my heritage bike that I'm never gonna let go. This bike is new. This bike is stock, you know, the 2022. What I'll say is, with all the money that I have into my Dyna Lowrider S, this stock 2022 Lowrider ST is a force to be reckoned with. Obviously, they're going to hit different points in different ways, but first and foremost, what I will say is, for all the work that I put into this Dyna Lowrider S, this stock ST actually comes pretty close performance-wise, if not does some things better than my Dyna with all the work that I have into it. I'm not going to say that it's better in every category. It's not, just because this bike has been customized and personalized to me so much at this point. But what I'll say is, it's a force to be reckoned with out the box, which I think that there's something to be said about that. First and foremost, what I'll say is, the one thing that the Dyna Lowrider S is never going to touch the Softail ST in is just smoothness. You know, you're never going to come close to how smooth the ST is, and that's out the box. And again, you're coming with inverted forks in the front end, you're coming with the monoshock technology, you're coming with the Milwaukee 8 motor. It's just never going to be as smooth, right? But, you know, some people don't want that. You know, the Dyna is not that smooth. The Dyna is definitely bringing the ruckus. So you still have that Dyna character. You still have that twin cam character to it. But at the end of the day, you know, I've done a lot of work to this Dyna to try to make it that smooth. So, you know, we upgraded both rear and front motor mounts. We got the suspension dialed in. So don't get me wrong, my Dyna is still very, very smooth. You know, probably the smoothest Dyna I've ever ridden. But it's not going to even come anywhere close to how smooth this ST is. And again, we're talking two very different motors with two very different temperaments, so that kind of makes sense. In terms of, you know, I'm not going to talk too much about the fairings because I did shoot a video specifically talking about the fairings. There are two very different fairings, as you can see. They perform differently. They obviously look differently. So again, I don't want to talk too much about that because I'm going to cover that in a separate video. I'm also not going to talk too much about the bags, the Leather Pros versus the stock ST bags, because again, I am going to cover that in another video. What I will say is, the bikes both sit very differently. You know, as you can see, if you look at that seat on the Dyna, you know, it almost kind of sits level, I feel like, right? Where you have the step up in the back. Whereas if you look at how the Softail sits, there's a very clear, aggressive angle that comes out of there. So the bikes sit differently. It's hard to say. I almost feel like because of that lean angle and the way you sit on the frame, I almost kind of feel like I'm getting more of an FXR vibe from the ST, where I feel like I'm sitting more into the bike rather than on top of the bike with the Dyna. So that's definitely a big difference. Comparison that's worth talking about is the brakes. So I've said this in a previous video, but yo, let me tell you, for the amount of money that I threw into the brakes on this Dyna, this Lowrider ST stops just as good, or if not better. So if you are gonna buy the 2022 ST, leave the brakes alone. The thing stops on a dime. And again, I had to throw a lot of money into my Dyna brakes to get it at that level. So braking wise, the thing rips. The motors, well, you know, the motors couldn't be any more different. A 124 SNS is an absolute monster, right? It's an absolute monster. It's show you no mercy at all. It's vicious, dude. It's a very vicious motor. The 117 Milwaukee 8, don't get me wrong, man. Low end and high end, the thing absolutely moves. I am never wanting for power on this bike. If we were to race these bikes, my Dyna no doubt is gonna beat this bike, you know. And again, we're talking a 124 SNS crate versus a 117 Milwaukee 8, so no doubt it's going to beat it in all conditions, right? But where the 117 actually really shines, and I talked about this in a previous video, is this motor, especially if I'm running it in New York City conditions, if I'm having to deal with like high traffic conditions or whatever, it gets really hot, it's not happy, and that's even with the oil cooler and the Love Jugs fans. Whereas this motor, if I'm running it in high traffic situations, if I'm running it in the city, if I'm running it in Brooklyn, it handles it like a pro, dude. So that's one thing that I really like about the 117 Milwaukee 8, is it just burns so cool, and you don't have to sacrifice power. Like, we're talking a 117 versus a 124. At the end of the day, these are both giant monster motors, but the difference is this is a hot rod, right? Whereas this one, you still get all the numbers, you still get the power, but you could also still, you know, be a little bit more realistic and have it burn a little bit lower, which is nice. Fuel mileage wise, dude, this ST gets a lot more miles to gallon than the Dyna does. It's pretty wild, dude. So in terms of the bike trips, you know, and again, I made this bike into a hot rod, so I wasn't really concerned with fuel economy. But one thing that's worth pointing out is even when this was a 110, I'm getting a lot more miles per gallon with the ST. And again, we're talking a very, very different motor, right? In terms of how you sit, well, yeah, like I said, I feel like I sit almost a little bit lower on the ST, whereas you definitely sit a little bit higher on a Dyna, especially a late year Dyna like my Fxdls. I'm definitely going to sit higher on that for sure. Both of them are dialed in the suspension, but again, the difference is I had to throw a lot of money to get my suspension dialed into my Dyna, whereas the ST, you're coming out the box with heavy hitting suspension. Specifically, the selling point for me with this bike is definitely the inverted forks front end, whereas if I wanted to do that in my Dyna, that's going to be an expensive job, man, for sure. I'm not even going to do the startup test. You know, the motors sound very different. That's actually not a fair test to do unless I had a Fab 28 on this ST. In terms of highway miles, they both absolutely crush the highway for sure. In terms of road trips, they're both definitely set up to do bike trips, right? But again, we're talking like a full-on custom hot rod versus the ST. To me, the ST is a more practical bike. Like, if I had my choice of doing a bike trip between these two bikes, I would be taking an ST over my Dyna any day. Again, it's just more practical. It's more miles per gallon. It's going to burn lower. At the end of the day, it's probably going to be a more reliable bike, right? And then, you know, there's like little things that, you know, are worth comparing. Again, I talked a little bit about city riding. For any of you that own a Dyna Lowrider S, it's a hard clutch, dude. Like, that's a hard clutch. Whereas the clutch on a Lowrider ST is a lot smoother. So clutch control, working the clutch, you're gonna have an easier time with that. And I mean, if we're talking about like rolling up to the bike night or whatever, you know, obviously I'm gonna roll up on my Dyna Lowrider S. You know, I've been through it all with that bike. That bike's more Fxdls Brooklyn than anything. But again, in terms of stacking miles, in terms of doing a bike trip, I'd be taking the Lowrider ST. You know, it's definitely, this bike in particular is just performing phenomenally in every condition. Whereas, you know, if I'm riding through the city with my Dyna Lowrider S, I'm only doing it for a means to an end. Whereas I could get away with city riding and not feeling like the motor's gonna melt with the ST. So these are just some initial comparisons, right? They're two very, very different temperaments. You know, we are talking a hot rod versus something that's still a monster motor, but definitely more practical. At the end of the day, I love them both. I would rip miles all day on either of these bikes. They both absolutely crush it. And yeah, man, you know, it's the hardest choice is which one am I going to ride? Which one am I going to ride today? But yeah, you know, there's a lot more we could talk about. I figure I'd leave it to you all in the comment section. What's some other questions that y'all have? That's a really, really hand-wavy, basic comparison. So y'all let me know in the comment section. What's another question you have? I'll do my best to address it. As always, stay safe, stay low, ride Dyna Lowrider S's, ride Lowrider STs. And on that, Fxdls Brooklyn is out.